Chosen ones. Something happened inside you, and it did not begin yesterday. It has been unfolding quietly for much longer than that. Somewhere beneath the routines, beneath the responsibilities, beneath the version of yourself that learned how to keep going even when you were exhausted, something shifted. You have been carrying a weight you could never fully explain, and at the same time, a fire that refused to go out. For a long time you thought the weight meant you were failing. You thought the restlessness meant something was wrong with you. But there has always been something deeper beneath those labels, something that has been watching your journey with far more understanding than you gave yourself. It saw you in the moments nobody else noticed. It saw the nights when you stared at the ceiling trying to understand why your life felt different from the lives around you. It saw the times you almost gave up explaining yourself, because being misunderstood hurt less than trying to make people understand. Through every season of silence, every disappointment, every chapter where it felt like nothing was moving, you developed something. Not through achievement, not through performance, through endurance. Through surviving what was never meant to break you. What you carry now is not damage from the past. It is strength shaped by the past. And whether you realize it or not, the forces that benefited from your confusion have always recognized the power you were growing into. The question was never whether it existed. The question is whether you are finally ready to see it for what it is. If you are hearing these words right now, treat that as meaningful. Life has a way of bringing people to the truths they are ready to receive. Something faithful has been guiding you here for longer than you know. Before we go any further, set everything else down for a moment. The unfinished tasks can wait. The notifications can wait. Take one slow breath and allow yourself to be fully present, because what you are about to understand may change the way you see your entire story, especially the chapters that hurt the most. You have felt this before. You felt it when you were young and noticed things you could never explain. You sensed the mood in a room before anyone spoke. You carried tension that did not belong to you and called it maturity because you had no other language for it. There were moments when you simply knew something, and even though you could not prove it, time eventually revealed that you were right. You felt it during quiet moments too, in prayer, in stillness, in creative spaces where time seemed to disappear and something larger moved through you. There were moments when an idea arrived whole before logic had a chance to build it. Moments when you touched something difficult to describe, but impossible to forget. Those experiences were never random. There are patterns running through your life, and they are beginning to form a picture. Not coincidences, not wishful thinking. Evidence. Signs that something within you has been waking up, even while the world around you offered very little language to explain it. The first pattern is your intuition. It no longer arrives as an occasional feeling. It arrives as a quiet knowing. Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling drained without understanding why? Have you ever felt relief when a plan fell apart because something deep inside you already knew it was never yours? You have sensed shifts before the evidence appeared. You have recognized truth before the facts caught up. The part of you that knows has been speaking for years. You are simply learning to trust its voice. And there is a reason for that. Before this message is over, you will understand more clearly where that knowing comes from and why it has been growing stronger. But that is only one part of the picture. The second pattern is harder to ignore. Places that once felt comfortable no longer fit the person you are becoming. Conversations that once filled entire evenings now leave you feeling empty. You find yourself sitting in familiar spaces while sensing that some part of you has already moved beyond them. This is not arrogance, it is alignment. There is a version of you that could still shrink itself to belong, a version that could still perform comfort in places that no longer nourish your spirit. But that version is fading. The discomfort you feel is not a flaw, it is direction. Your soul is responding to a season change, and it no longer wants to live where it has already outgrown itself. The third pattern is a creative pressure that refuses to leave you alone. Something inside you wants expression. It wants movement. It wants form. Sometimes it arrives in the middle of the night. Sometimes it appears during ordinary moments, when a possibility suddenly feels larger than the room you are sitting in. You try to ignore it, but it returns. This is deeper than ambition. This is deeper than impatience. There is a gift inside you that has been waiting for space to emerge, and it keeps pressing against the walls of your current life. What you feel is readiness. Not readiness because everything is perfect, but readiness because the waiting itself has shaped you. The fourth pattern appears in your dreams. Something about them has changed. Certain dreams stay with you long after the images fade. You wake carrying a feeling, a message, a sense that something important was placed in your hands while you slept. Your mind may struggle to explain it, but another part of you understands. You are receiving more than information. You are receiving preparation. Something is being formed in you before it becomes visible around you. The dream is often only the doorway. And then there is the fifth pattern, the one many people spend years learning to trust. When truth arrives, your body often recognizes it first. A sudden stillness, a feeling that settles deep in your chest, a quiet certainty that appears before your thoughts have organized themselves. You have experienced it before. For years you may have questioned those moments. You may have talked yourself out of them. But that inner recognition has been serving you faithfully all along. It is not irrational. It is not imagination. It is one of the deepest forms of knowing you carry. 5 patterns. 5 threads woven through experiences that once seemed unrelated. And when you step back far enough, they begin to reveal a single picture. The signs were never scattered. The evidence has been appearing for years. You simply had not called it evidence yet. What is happening inside you is not random. Something original is being remembered. Something that has been waiting beneath the noise, beneath the confusion, beneath the years of adaptation. And the first truth you need to understand about this process is this. There is something you need to understand about what has been happening inside you. This is not merely symbolism, and it is not wishful thinking wrapped in spiritual language. There is a real state of human awareness, one that has been observed, studied, and experienced by some of the most creative minds in history. Yet for most adults, it appears only in brief moments before slipping away again. For decades, neuroscientist Roger Sperry studied the relationship between the two halves of the human brain. One side helps us analyze, organize, and move through the world logically. The other sees patterns, connections, possibilities, and meanings that cannot always be measured. Most people spend their lives leaning heavily on one while barely hearing the voice of the other. But there are moments when that separation softens, moments when logic and intuition stop competing and begin working together. When insight arrives with unusual clarity, when creativity feels less like effort and more like remembering. Researchers gave this state a name, but people who have experienced it rarely need one. They simply know the feeling. You know it too, maybe not every day and maybe not whenever you wanted, but you have touched it. There were moments when the answer appeared before the process, moments when ideas arrived whole, moments when you solved something in minutes that struggle could not solve in hours. It felt as though every part of you was finally moving in the same direction. Many of history's most extraordinary creators described working from a place like this. Their breakthroughs did not always arrive through force. They arrived through alignment. What emerged seemed to come from somewhere deeper than ordinary thought, from a place where imagination, intuition, and reason were no longer separated by walls. The truth is that this state is not created by genius. It is where genius begins. You were not born outside of it. You entered life much closer to it than you realize. As a child, before expectations became louder than curiosity, before survival became more important than wonder, your mind operated with a natural wholeness that most adults eventually lose touch with. Think about who you were before you learned to second-guess yourself, before you started looking outside yourself for permission, before you became skilled at adapting to environments that rewarded conformity more than authenticity. There was a freedom in the way you perceived the world, a natural openness, a trust in what you sensed. Researchers have long observed that young children display remarkable creative capacity, not because they possess more information than adults, but because the connections within them remain open. The signal is still clear. The inner conversation is still whole. They have not yet been trained to silence one part of themselves in favor of another. Then life begins to shape them. Expectations arrive, systems arrive, pressure arrives. Slowly, often without noticing, many people learn how to function while becoming disconnected from part of their own nature. They become productive, responsible, efficient, yet something feels missing, even if they cannot explain what. Perhaps you know that feeling. Perhaps there were seasons when you looked at your life and wondered why everything appeared functional on the surface, while something deeper felt distant. Maybe you spent years asking yourself what was wrong with you, why your best moments felt so alive, yet so difficult to sustain. The truth may be much simpler than you were led to believe. Nothing essential was broken. Something was interrupted. Something valuable was pushed into the background, while other parts of you were trained to take control. The gift did not disappear. It went quiet. It waited. And maybe that is why this message is finding you now. Because some part of you never stopped searching. Some part of you remembered that there was more available than the version of life you were taught to settle for. Even during the seasons when you doubted yourself, that deeper knowing remained alive beneath the surface. What happens when that inner connection fades is not always dramatic. Most people do not wake up one morning feeling lost. It happens gradually. Life becomes a series of tasks to complete, problems to solve, responsibilities to carry. Days become crowded with obligations, and the deeper voice within gets interrupted so often that eventually it begins to sound distant. Yet it never fully leaves. The intuitive part of you, the part that recognizes truth before proof arrives, the part that senses patterns others overlook, remains present. It waits patiently beneath the noise, like someone trying to finish a sentence in a room where everyone else keeps talking. According to neurologist Dr. Daniel Barron, this gradual separation is influenced by forces that shape nearly every modern life. The first begins early. Many educational systems reward memorization, repetition, and compliance far more than imagination, curiosity, or original thought. Over time, certain capacities are strengthened, while others receive far less attention. The second force is the quiet pressure many people carry every day. Not moments of true danger, but the constant background weight of modern living. The bills that need paying, the goals that remain unfinished, the feeling that you should be further along by now, the exhausting effort of appearing okay while carrying more than anyone realizes. You know that feeling. There were seasons when you were not asking for a breakthrough, you were asking for a breath. Times when the greatest burden was not failure, but the endless effort of holding everything together while pretending it was easy. And when the mind remains in that state long enough, it becomes focused on survival. Survival is useful when danger is present, but survival is a poor environment for creativity, intuition, insight, and deep inner knowing. The brain learns to scan for problems rather than possibilities. It learns to react rather than perceive. That is why what you are experiencing matters, because the part of you that has been waking up is not something new, it is something original, something that existed long before the noise, long before the pressure, long before the world convinced you that being productive was more important than being whole. And what comes next begins with understanding that difference. The mind cannot live in survival and deep flow at the same time. When survival is active, it wins, every time. And that brings us to a third force that has quietly shaped the lives of so many people: the steady erosion of attention itself. The ability to stay with one thought, one idea, one moment long enough for something meaningful to emerge has been shrinking for years. Whole brain awareness does not exist on the surface of life. It lives in depth. It lives beyond constant notifications, endless urgency, and the habit of reacting to everything the moment it appears. Yet much of modern life pulls attention in the opposite direction, training people to skim rather than immerse, to react rather than listen, to consume rather than create. When these forces work together over time, the result becomes familiar. You catch glimpses of something extraordinary in prayer, in creativity, in stillness, in those rare moments when everything suddenly feels clear. You touch it for a moment, and then it slips away again. Not because it was never real, but because the conditions that support it rarely remain long enough for it to stay. And that is where the story becomes deeper than science alone can explain. Because what has been waking up inside you is not simply a mental advantage. It is not merely improved performance or increased productivity. It is a different way of seeing. A unified mind notices patterns that fragmented thinking misses. It recognizes truth beneath appearances. It senses when something is aligned and when something only pretends to be. There are moments when guidance rises from a place deeper than logic, from somewhere beneath the noise that fills everyday life. You have felt this before, even if you did not always trust it. Across generations and across cultures, people have described this state in different ways. Some called it wisdom, some called it inspiration, some called it communion. Whatever language was used, they were pointing toward the same reality: a human being operating from a deeper connection to the intelligence that created them. And this is why your story matters more than you realize. The confusion you experienced was never just personal. The forces that pull people away from clarity are real. A distracted mind is easier to influence. A fragmented mind is easier to control. A person disconnected from their own inner knowing spends years searching outside themselves for what was already waiting within. But a person who recovers that connection becomes difficult to deceive, difficult to distract, difficult to convince that they are powerless. The challenge was never your effort. You have already proven your willingness to work, endure, and keep going. The greater threat has always been your clarity, because clarity changes everything. When you know who you are, many of the things that once controlled you lose their grip. When you can hear your own inner knowing clearly, confusion begins to lose its authority. And when your mind starts operating as a whole rather than in fragments, life itself begins to look different. That is why what you have been experiencing is not random. The recognition you feel right now is part of the preparation. Something inside you is remembering what it has always known. And because of that, I want to speak plainly before we continue. There is a tool developed by a team of neuroscientists based on the exact research we have been discussing. It was created for people who recognize themselves in this message, people who know there is more available to them than the scattered, exhausted version of themselves they have been taught to accept. This is not another complicated system. It is not a program that demands hours of discipline or asks you to completely rearrange your life. It is an 8-minute audio experience built using neural synchronization technology, designed to help create the conditions where both hemispheres of the brain can begin working together again, the way they naturally did earlier in life. The process itself is remarkably simple. You put on headphones, you sit quietly, you breathe. That is all. We will return to it shortly because there is more you need to understand first. But some of you have already felt something stir while listening, and it felt important to acknowledge that. Sometimes truth is recognized before it is fully explained. If that inner pull is already present, the information is available in the description and pinned comment. Explore it only if it resonates deeply with you. There is no need to force anything. What comes next will provide the context. Because there is another truth that matters just as much. The state you have been reaching for does not return through effort alone. This may be one of the most important ideas in this entire message. You cannot fight your way back into wholeness. You cannot outwork fragmentation. You cannot restore balance by demanding more from the same part of yourself that has already been carrying too much for too long. Restoration happens when the right conditions are present. Certain forms of sound interact with the brain in ways that bypass much of the constant mental filtering that occupies everyday awareness. Carefully designed auditory patterns can help guide the brain away from chronic survival responses and toward the synchronized state that researchers have spent decades studying, the same state you have touched during your most creative, inspired, and spiritually connected moments. This is where years of research have been leading. The architecture was mapped, the mechanisms were studied, the applications were refined. And now that understanding has been distilled into something that fits into 8 minutes of an ordinary morning. What people often report is not some dramatic overnight transformation. It is something quieter and, in many ways, more meaningful. They describe the return of something familiar. Thoughts begin to flow more naturally. Decisions become clearer. Conversations feel easier because the right words arrive when they are needed. Creative ideas stop feeling trapped behind an invisible wall. There is a growing sense that life is moving with them instead of against them. Many describe it as reconnecting with a version of themselves they remember from childhood. A version that felt curious, alive, creative, and deeply present. Not because they became someone new, but because they stopped living so far away from who they had always been. This is not about becoming superhuman, it is about becoming whole. When the conditions that suppress natural function are removed, and the conditions that support it are restored, the mind often begins doing what it was designed to do from the beginning. And what you are seeking may not be something you need to acquire at all. It may be something you are finally ready to remember. Before we go any further, there is one more truth beneath everything we have talked about so far. And if you truly hear it, it changes the way you understand your entire journey. It changes the meaning of the delays, the confusion, the years that seem to take more from you than they gave. This is the part many people never reach because it asks you to look at your story through a completely different lens. What if the years that felt like suppression were also years of preparation? What if the seasons that made you question yourself were quietly developing something within you that comfort never could? The people who have walked through the deepest wilderness often assume they have been damaged by it. Yet again and again, life reveals something surprising. They emerge carrying a kind of wisdom that could only have been earned there. You know what it feels like to search for something you cannot name. You know what it feels like to sense that a part of yourself has gone missing and spend years trying to find your way back. And because you have lived through that search, your perception changed. You became more attentive, more sensitive, more capable of recognizing what is real and what only appears real. There are things you notice now that your younger self would have missed. You read the energy behind the words. You sense when something feels aligned and when it does not. You recognize the difference between truth and performance. Not because life was easy, but because life required you to learn those distinctions for yourself. Many people inherit certainty. You built it. You built it in seasons when there was very little evidence that anything was changing. You built it during mornings when you kept moving forward without knowing whether your efforts would lead anywhere. You built it during nights when you questioned everything and somehow continued anyway. That kind of faith is different. It is not an emotion, It becomes part of your structure. And that is why one of the greatest misunderstandings about your journey is the belief that your struggles happened in the way of your purpose. In many cases, they became part of it. The searching sharpened you, the waiting deepened you, the losses taught you what mattered. The silence strengthened your ability to hear. The child you once were carried natural brilliance, but the person you are now carries something more layered. You carry insight shaped by experience. You carry discernment forged through disappointment. You carry resilience that only develops when someone survives seasons they once believed would break them. That combination is rare. It does not emerge from comfort. It does not emerge from a life where every answer arrives on time. It develops in people who were required to go deeper than convenience. People who had to discover who they were without constant reassurance. People who learned how to trust something invisible long before they could prove it. There is another way to understand what happened to you. The forces that seemed to separate you from your power also taught you the value of it. The absence revealed the importance of what had been lost. The longing revealed what mattered. And the years spent searching developed capacities that never would have formed if everything had been easy from the beginning. So standing here now, you are not beginning again. You are arriving. You are arriving at something that has been calling you for much longer than you realize. And when you look back one day, you may discover that what felt like detours were actually part of the path all along. Let me say it simply. You entered life with a mind that naturally operated in a more integrated way. Over time, the pressures of education, stress, adaptation, and modern life gradually interrupted that state. Yet traces of it remained. You felt them in prayer. You felt them during moments of deep creativity. You felt them in stillness, in intuition, in flashes of clarity that seemed to arrive from somewhere beyond ordinary thinking. Those moments were never imaginary. There were times when an answer appeared before the explanation, times when a solution arrived whole before logic could assemble it piece by piece. Times when something inside you knew, and later life revealed that knowing was accurate. You were touching the edge of a state that science is only beginning to fully describe, and perhaps that is why you have never fully settled. Many people eventually accept the fog. They accept the forgetfulness. They accept the feeling that a brighter, more creative version of themselves somehow faded with age. Not because they wanted to, but because they assumed that was simply how life worked. But something in you kept questioning it. Something in you kept asking why your clearest moments felt so different from your ordinary ones. Something in you refused to believe that the most alive version of yourself had disappeared forever. And that question matters more than you know, because the people who continue asking that question are often the ones who remember. They remember that there was once a way of thinking that felt effortless, a way of creating that felt natural, a way of being that felt connected rather than fragmented. They may not have had language for it, but they remember the feeling. And that memory is not an accident. Researchers like Roger Sperry spent years studying the relationship between the two hemispheres of the brain and discovered something remarkable. Each side possesses extraordinary abilities on its own, yet something entirely different becomes possible when they function together as a unified system. Most people heard the headline and moved on. Very few stopped to consider the deeper implication. The implication was that extraordinary clarity may not belong only to extraordinary people. It may belong to human beings operating closer to their original design. Studies consistently show that young children demonstrate astonishing levels of creative capacity before years of conditioning begin narrowing the way they think, perceive, and engage with the world. That gap between childhood possibility and adult limitation is not simply a mystery of aging. It is the story many people have been living. It is the distance between the version of yourself that occasionally appears during your most inspired moments and the version that has been trying to navigate life through constant pressure, distraction, and mental fragmentation. And that difference is more personal than you may realize. I recently heard the story of a nurse who spent years caring for others while quietly feeling disconnected from herself. She described it in a way that stayed with me. She said there were seasons when it felt as though life was happening around her, even to her, but rarely through her. She was present in her own story, yet somehow felt separated from the part of herself that was meant to fully live it. She described it in a way that stayed with me. It was as if she had been watching her own life from a distance, aware that she was meant to be fully present in it, yet somehow separated from the part of herself holding the steering wheel. Then something shifted. Not dramatically, not overnight, just quietly, steadily, almost like a forgotten light beginning to come back on. After 2 weeks of spending 8 minutes a day with the process, she noticed something she had not felt in years. She trusted her own thinking again. Ideas stopped feeling incomplete. Decisions no longer felt like traps where every choice might be the wrong one. For the first time in a long time, her mind felt like it belonged to her. That is what many people describe when the fragmentation begins to lift. Not a mystical transformation, not becoming someone new. A return. A reconnection with capacities that were already there, waiting beneath years of noise, stress, and adaptation. Because of that, a team of neuroscientists led by Dr. Daniel Barron, a neurologist with more than 2 decades of experience studying brain function, set out to build something practical. Not something that required retreating from your life, not something that demanded thousands of dollars in equipment or endless hours of training, something a real person could actually use. What they created was remarkably simple. 8 minutes, headphones, eyes closed. A carefully engineered auditory sequence designed to help create the conditions for both hemispheres of the brain to begin working together again in a more synchronized way. A state many people naturally experienced earlier in life, before years of conditioning, pressure, and distraction interrupted the connection. They call it the Genius Switch. It is not a supplement. It is not another meditation app. And it is not one of the countless recordings online that borrow scientific language without carrying the actual engineering behind it. According to Dr. Barron's team, many alternatives sound similar on the surface, but lack the neural synchronization architecture required to produce the intended effect. Some of you may already feel skeptical. That is understandable. You may have tried things before. You may have invested your time, your hope, and your attention into promises that never delivered what they claimed. That hesitation is reasonable. What makes this approach different, according to the research behind it, is that the goal is not stimulating one part of the brain in isolation. The goal is synchronization. The relationship between both hemispheres matters. The experience is designed around creating the conditions where that relationship can function more harmoniously, rather than emphasizing one side at the expense of the other. The system was developed specifically to address that challenge. When the work was first presented professionally, colleagues reportedly suggested that its value could easily justify a much higher price. Compared to traditional neurofeedback sessions, which can cost hundreds of dollars per appointment, or personal neurofeedback equipment that can cost thousands, the intention was to make the experience accessible. Instead of hundreds of dollars, the program was released at $49. And for those accessing it through this message, there is an additional discount available, bringing the current cost to $39. If you decide to move forward, several additional resources are included. There is a guided visualization designed to help you apply these principles in everyday life. There is a nutrition guide focused on common contributors to mental fog and practical adjustments that may support greater clarity. There is a classic book exploring aligned living and personal transformation, along with a visual guide outlining daily habits associated with maintaining a more integrated mental state. The entire package is backed by a full money-back guarantee, no complicated conditions, no requirement to prove how often you used it. If your experience does not match what was promised, you can request a refund. That guarantee exists because the creators believe in what they built. There is one additional point worth mentioning. If you search online for products using similar names, you will likely find many alternatives. Some borrow the language, some borrow the concepts. Yet according to the research team, many of them do not contain the synchronization design that forms the foundation of this approach. The official sequence is available only through Dr. Barron and his team, and the information can be found in the description and pinned comment. If something inside you has been responding throughout this message, if part of you recognizes the experience of touching moments of clarity and wondering why they never seem to last, then the invitation is simple. Explore it for yourself. Give yourself the opportunity to discover what 8 minutes a day might make possible. No complicated setup, no special equipment beyond a pair of headphones. Just a few quiet minutes and a willingness to receive. And if your spirit recognizes something meaningful here, follow that knowing. Because you were never designed to live disconnected from your own depth. You were never meant to settle for a version of yourself that only operates from a fraction of what it carries. The journey you have walked, the confusion, the waiting, the seasons where your gifts seemed hidden even from you, have all been shaping something deeper than you realized. The people who pass through long seasons of suppression and eventually find their way back carry a kind of understanding that comfort alone cannot teach. They understand what clarity costs. They understand what persistence requires. They understand why the waiting mattered. And that is why this moment is not really about gaining power. It is about returning to it. The part of you that once saw clearly never disappeared. The child who noticed things other people overlooked, who learned quickly, who trusted what they felt before they could explain it, was never erased. That part of you simply learned how to survive in a world that rewarded certainty over wonder and conformity over inner knowing. It went quiet, not because it was gone, but because it was waiting. You have spent years carrying evidence of that waiting. There were moments when you felt strangely disconnected from yourself, as if the person you were becoming had drifted too far from the person you once knew. There were seasons when you wondered whether something essential had been lost forever. Yet what you were really surviving was the illusion that the loss was permanent. The forces that worked against your growth could not truly destroy what was placed within you. So they settled for something else. They encouraged forgetting. They encouraged distraction. They encouraged doubt. And for a time, that forgetting became part of your experience, not because you were weak, but because you had not yet been given language for what had happened, or a path back toward what had always been there. Now you do. You have a name for what you felt. You have a framework for what seemed confusing. And perhaps most importantly, you have begun remembering. Across many wisdom traditions, there is a moment just before the crossing. Not after the breakthrough, not after the celebration. The moment before it. The moment when someone finally looks back over the road they have traveled and realizes that what appeared to be random suffering was actually preparation. The delays begin to look different. The disappointments begin to look different. Even the unanswered questions begin to reveal another layer of meaning. What once looked like punishment starts looking like construction. What once felt like abandonment starts revealing itself as formation. That is the threshold you are standing on now. Think about the relationships that taught you loyalty by forcing you to experience loss. Think about the dreams that arrived years before the opportunities needed to carry them. Think about the mornings when you prayed without seeing evidence that anyone was listening and somehow kept praying anyway. Think about the nights when you wrestled with questions so deeply that easy answers could no longer satisfy you. None of it was wasted. The tears were not wasted. The waiting was not wasted. The confusion was not wasted. Even the seasons that felt empty were shaping capacities that could not have been developed any other way. There is a reason this realization brings peace. Because when you finally understand that your life has been preparing you instead of punishing you, something inside you relaxes. The struggle to make sense of everything begins to soften. One of the ancient stories tells of Solomon standing before a responsibility far greater than anything he felt prepared to carry. What is remarkable is not that he became wise. It is what happened before that. He admitted that what had been placed in front of him exceeded what he currently possessed. That honesty became the doorway. The response was not more instructions, it was more capacity, more access. The exact expansion required for the assignment ahead. And that is what this season feels like. You do not need another 100 steps to follow. You do not need endless information. What you need is greater capacity to carry what has already been calling you. The clarity you have been seeking in prayer, in creativity, in decision-making, in your ability to recognize what is true, is not reserved for a special few. It is not a personality trait that some people receive while others are left without it. It emerges naturally when the mind begins operating the way it was originally designed to operate. And that is why the delay mattered. The confusion delayed it, the pressure delayed it, the distractions delayed it. But none of those things destroyed it. The delay is over. Take a moment and let that settle somewhere deeper than thought. Not in the part of you that immediately analyzes everything. Let it settle in the quieter place beneath analysis. The place that recognized something familiar in this message before your mind could explain why. That part of you already knows. Before this message comes to an end, I want to speak directly to the person who has carried their journey mostly in silence. The person who remained faithful when there was little evidence that faithfulness mattered. The person who kept creating, kept searching, kept asking questions, even when the world rewarded people for simply fitting in. You were seen. The effort was seen. The tears were seen. The courage required to keep going when nobody understood what you were carrying was seen. Your formation was never accidental. What is returning now is not payment for lost time. It is the expansion of a person who needed every lesson, every challenge, and every season to become capable of carrying what comes next. Take one slow breath. Feel it fully. The strength you carry today was not created overnight. It was shaped by years of becoming, years of staying when it would have been easier to leave, years of believing when certainty was unavailable, years of protecting a small inner flame through storms that gave you every reason to let it go out. And that person, the one those years created, is who you are now. What is beginning is not the arrival of something foreign. It is the return of something original. A mind reconnecting with itself, a deeper intelligence becoming available again, a wholeness that was always present beneath the fragmentation. You did not force this moment into existence. You stayed long enough to reach it. You kept walking through the wilderness until the wilderness finally ended. There were seasons when confusion seemed stronger than clarity, seasons when delays felt permanent, seasons when it looked as though the life you sensed inside you would never fully emerge. Yet what was placed within you by the source that placed it there was never vulnerable to permanent loss. It could be hidden, it could be delayed, it could grow quiet, but it could never be erased. And then there comes a morning when something clicks into place. A morning when years of searching suddenly make sense. A morning when what felt distant begins moving toward you with unmistakable certainty. That morning is now. If someone comes to mind while you hear these words, someone who has been carrying questions they cannot explain, someone who feels that there must be more available to them than what they have experienced so far, share this message with them. Not because they need advice, because they may need confirmation. Leave a word in the comments if something here spoke to a truth you have been carrying quietly. Not for numbers, not for visibility, for the person who arrives after you and needs to know they are not the only one who has felt this way. Sometimes a single sentence from someone else's journey becomes the sign another person has been praying for. And if the invitation we discussed still feels alive within you after this message ends, the path remains available. The information can be found in the description and pinned comment whenever the timing feels right. Take the 8 minutes, put on the headphones, close your eyes. Give yourself the space to remember what has been waiting beneath the noise. The life you were made to live does not begin someday. It begins when you stop postponing your return to yourself. Everything that came before has been leading here. Go forward with the wholeness that has belonged to you all along.